Hello everyone, thanks so much for coming today. I'm Victoria Hughes, I'm from the Seebohm Rowntree Foundation and I lead our work in York and the North East. This is the first of two sessions we've got today on wealth. The second one is on community wealth building. Please stay around. We've got some amazing sweet treats, I've been told, that are going to be at the back of the room as if you needed any incentive to stay. But yeah, the session later would be great. So it's community wealth building, but looking at the work with the York Mayor that we've been doing in the city. So you might be thinking, why a Seebohm Rowntree Foundation running two sessions on wealth? This is an organisation that cares about poverty. And we at the foundation increasingly think you cannot care about poverty and tackle poverty without really thinking about wealth and inequality and power. So that's why we're talking about this today. And when I talk about wealth, what I'm not really talking about is wealth that comes from sort of earnings, what I would call ordinary wealth, where people work hard, can make a living. It's not that wealth. The wealth I'm talking about is wealth that is developed through the ownership of assets. So that could be housing, land, like wealth associated with finance, so moving money around the system. And as you'll know, we're seeing a huge increase in that amount of extreme wealth. So a smallish in the past number of people holding a huge amount of wealth, and that number growing very, very rapidly. And you might say, well, why is that a problem? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, about why that is a problem and why we think it's a problem. One of the reasons I think it is a problem is around wealth and democracy and the power that wealth brings in terms of whose voices are heard. So the Rowntrees historically also really cared about this. So back in 1903, they bought a local newspaper, the Northern Echo, which was my paper where I grew up, and they wanted more of a balanced view in the press and more of a liberal view. So they actually bought a newspaper. Now the media is much more complicated than that nowadays, as we know. We can't necessarily do that. But the fact that they knew the issues with power and democracy in the media is something that is historically important and running through our work. And there was a quote I found from Joseph himself, who said, unscrupulous wealth, we need to guard against unscrupulous wealth which influences public opinion largely through the press. So that very instinct, who owns the media, but also, who owns assets, how is wealth created and generated, and how do we steward that wealth much more fairly, are key questions for JRF alongside how do we tackle poverty. And I would say, Nick and I were just talking about lots of different subjects, but about JRF as an organisation. And we are wealth holders. We have the endowment from the Rowntree family, which again we'll touch on today. So the sort of fair stewardship of money is something that we are looking at very closely and holding a mirror up to ourselves as wealth holders and thinking very carefully about how to do that in the most equitable way, in line with our mission. And that is absolutely ongoing work, which we will always be doing. The other thing I would say is actually that linking back to the Rowntree history gives us a really exciting opportunity to look at wealth. And so one of the things we're going to be talking about today is this programme that we're beginning, which I am very excited about. Kate is in my team and has heard me talking about this for the past couple of years and is pleased that we're finally doing it, because maybe I'll stop asking people to get involved in this. So this is revisiting Seebohm Rowntree's original poverty mapping in York. So it's 125 years ago this year since he did that mapping across all of the streets of York, and we'll hear about this shortly, and really identifying, areas of poverty across the whole city at the same time as Charles Booth was doing that in London. And the outcome of that work has been incredibly powerful in really shifting views around this not being because of the individual failings of a person, this being linked to systemic issues in our economy. And so we're hoping in carrying out this revisiting of the Seebohm Rowntree mapping and looking at wealth rather than poverty, so looking at wealth, land, assets across the city, I'm really excited about the opportunity to again shine a light on this issue of this isn't necessarily because of individual endeavour. This wealth is being produced through systems and the economic system that we have. So we'll hear a bit about that today from our wonderful panel, who I will introduce shortly. So the sort of arc of what you're going to hear today is looking back, so past, present, and then a bit of future. So we're going to start with Nick Smith from the Rowntree Society, who's going to talk about Seebohm's mapping, which I'm very excited to hear more about. So Nick is going to talk about the mapping, why it was done, what it looked like, you know, some of these changes that it brought about. Really pleased to have Professor Karen Rowlingson from York University, who's going to talk a bit more about why wealth matters and why we really need to pay attention to this, and a bit around the collaboration with York University to take forward the mapping that I mentioned. So this is a collaboration. And then I'm really pleased that we've got Natasha Almond, who's from a good organisation. He's going to talk about the community participation in mapping, and we really want this to be community-led. So Seebohm's mapping, I don't know if anyone's read any of it. It was very much done to people. It was of its time. And if you read some of the sort of descriptions of households, there was a lot of judgment about how people lived their lives. So definitely when we're reimagining this mapping to look at wealth, reimagining the methodology is something that we really want to do. So we want this to be community-led and participatory. So we will hear from each of our amazing speakers. We're then going to have a short panel discussion, and then we're going to hand over to you guys for any questions that you have. So as you're listening, please keep a mental note of anything that you want us to come back to at the end. So I'm going to hand over to begin with to Nick.
Thank you. Great. My name's Nick Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Rowntree Society. And the Rowntree Society's purpose is to build and share knowledge about the histories of the Rowntree family, company, and the Joseph Rowntree Trust, as well as the continuing relevance to the issues facing us today. So I'm going to talk about Seebohm's first poverty study of York. But first, I thought we'd look at his family's approach to wealth and how that was based in York and kind of what led up to it, to his study. So the Quaker Rowntree family, who most of you will know are most well known for their confectionery company, famous for creating products such as Kit Kats, fruit pastels, and polo. They're also involved in social reform, workers' welfare, etc. And the Rowntree company became not just the source of the family's wealth, but also a place where they could most easily put their values into practice and improve the lives of their workers. And so if we're thinking about wealth, not just personal wealth, some of the things that they did in the factory, would have added to the kind of wealth that those workers and their families had. So by 1920, this included the implementation of an 8-hour day and a 5-day working week, medical provision including a doctor's surgery, dentist, optician, free to employees and their families, welfare officers that are similar to what we would call social workers today, a pension scheme, an education that was compulsory up to the age of 17, and workers were starting the factory from age 14, but also continuing education, so courses for adults, a library at the factory, and a system of workplace democracy, which included active workers' involvement in writing the factory rules and also a disciplinary appeals process. So if workers felt that they'd been disciplined unfairly, there was a process and people they could go to. And by the 1930s, they'd also added a psychology department and a profit-sharing scheme. So I'm going to start with Joseph Rowntree. Joseph's someone who is frequently cited as turning in his grave for almost anything that happens in York. So I think he's probably perpetually spinning at this rate. But he was a man with strongly held convictions, and we really need to understand what he really thought and felt, not just attach him to any idea that anyone else in York has. So if we're going to think about his views on wealth, there's two key documents that tell us those. The first is the more famous, which is now known as the Founders' Memorandum, written in December 1904, which established the three Joseph Rowntree Trusts. Nowadays, they're called the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust, and the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust. They all have slightly different roles, but are unified in a purpose to find and address the underlying causes of societal issues, such as poverty. The Trust's endowment came in the form of shares in the Rowntree Company, and this meant that up until 1969, they were the major shareholders in the company. And so therefore, wealth produced by the company was put to use by the trusts in their social reform work. And it's probably also worth kind of recognizing that, particularly in the early days, the Rowntree wealth was quite fluid between the family, the trusts, and the company. And that's not just money, but also assets, books, furniture, I've heard being brought between the library, the company, the family, homes, etc., and even where meetings were held. So two quotes from the Founders' Memorandum that set out Joseph's views on wealth. The first one is that it is frequently and truly said that money is generally best spent by a person's during their lifetime. I have in the past, according to my power, endeavoured to act in remembrance of this. Considerably larger means have, however, come to me in later life, and the practical question was presented to me: how can this be properly applied in the future so as to secure equal results to those which might have been obtained had I had the administration of it over a lengthened period of time? So Joseph basically at this point had more wealth than he felt he needed. He was 68 at the time, so he's perhaps thinking about how much longer he'd be alive. And he's asking the question, what do you do with money if you can't spend it in your lifetime? And a second quote from the same document sets out a criticism of philanthropy or charity and how that's usually applied to wealth. And he said, I feel that much of the current philanthropic effort is directed at remedying the more superficial manifestations of weakness or evil, while little thought or effort is directed to search out their underlying cause. Obvious distress or evil generally evokes so much feeling that the necessary agency for alleviating it are pretty adequately supported. But the soup kitchen in York never has difficulty in obtaining adequate financial aid, but an inquiry into the extent and causes of poverty would enlist little support. And that final sentence, it's worth noting that the soup kitchen in York was set up by his father. And we're going to come back to that point about a lack of support for an inquiry into the causes of poverty, because, spoiler, that's what Seebohm did. The second document that states Joseph's views on wealth covers it much more in depth and more strongly. And this is his memorandum written for my children upon the opportunities of wealth and the dangers connected with it. It was written in September 1907, almost 3 years after the Founders' Memorandum. Joseph loved a memorandum. I'm not entirely sure why he couldn't have just written this as a letter to his children. And although it's addressed to his children, who by then were adults, Joseph states in it that his main concern is for his grandchildren, mainly because the wealth that they were growing up in, that it was, on a different level to what him and his children had. So he reiterates in this memorandum that wealth is generally best spent in one's lifetime again, but then goes on to the quote on the slide here, which I'll read. He says, it really is a piece of culpable stupidity on the part of those who have ample means to adopt a scale of expenditure that keeps them continually harassed about money matters and prevents them from making their mental powers or their wealth available for local or national needs. And the enormous increase in wealth which has come to the country since the introduction of machinery has not been at all evenly distributed across the population, and that the share of the great body of workers, the share to the great body of workers has been inadequate. I suppose almost all social reformers would admit that the problem of the distribution of wealth is, in this country, much more urgent than the problem of its creation. I'm taken by how kind of contemporary the last bit of that quote feels, and that what he identifies, that the inequality, that there's inequality of wealth in the country, the majority of workers don't have enough, and that distribution of wealth is more urgent than its creation. And so this is the inheritance that Seebohm took from his father. And he didn't just take his father's philosophical approach on wealth, but also the importance of investigating poverty, a lack of wealth, by using facts, figures, and statistics, in short, from his perspective, science. Joseph had written 2 essays in the 1860s which preempted Seebohm's work, and they undertook an analysis of poverty from evidence gathered by basically government bodies that were working on things like the poor laws. And also remember in Joseph's founder's memorandum, he talked there about there being little support for an inquiry into the extent of poverty. Well, he wrote that 3 years after Seebohm's book had been published, which might say something about how they got Seebohm's study off the ground. So what did Seebohm do in his book, Poverty, A Study of Town Life? Well, the research was started in 1899, and it was first published in 1901. And as Victoria said, it followed and kind of ran alongside work carried out by Charles Booth. And Seebohm was in correspondence with Charles Booth at the time. And Booth's work had shown that around 30% of London's population were living in poverty. And Seebohm's approach in York, being scientific, he wanted to know the facts, not assumptions or opinions. So for this, he needed definitions. So he decided that he was interested in households who did not employ servants. And his team went door to door, calling at almost all the households in York without servants, and presumably some with servants who they then discounted. And he basically asked the households questions about how they lived, their work, their lifestyle, how many people in the household. They'd have a bit of a nosy around the house and write some notes about how they were living. And often it was women that were at home when they called round. They were kind of doing it during the day when most men were at work. And he used this information to create his map, which you can see up on the screen. But we also have a display board of it over here that you'll be able to look at much closer later. But in the map, he identifies 4 different areas that he categorized as the first, which are the poorest, that Seebohm described as slum areas, but the main streets might be of a better class. The second was what he described as working class areas, but this might include some servant owning. The third were the main business streets. This is generally around the city centre, made up of shops, offices, but he also highlights that there were narrow lanes and courts. Many of this would have included people living in poverty. And then finally, the servant-keeping class. One of the things that's notable when you look at the map is a lot of the main roads into York are coloured in the colour for the servant-owning class. And this perhaps meant that if you were travelling through York, that you'd see all these nice houses and wouldn't be aware, really, of the poverty and the slums that were existing, behind them. His other conclusions was this idea of a poverty line. He established a minimum income, and we're talking about people whose only wealth is their income. And below this minimum income would be below the poverty line. And that minimum is what people would need to cover the absolute essentials. Seebohm at this time in his life got really interested in people's diets and what you would need to eat to be, in his words, efficient. And that's a big part of this minimum income. The next thing he came up with was a poverty cycle, where during someone's lifetime, they would move above and below this poverty line, thinking about, when people are children and they can't earn income themselves, they'd be below it, but then when they're able to start working, they might go above it. but then when they have a young family and are having children depending on them, they go below it again, etc. through their life. And this meant these two things, the poverty line, the poverty cycle, would basically keep people trapped, unable to get out of poverty or to gain any real wealth themselves. And he also, his figure for the amount of York's population who were living below the poverty line was 27.8%. So very similar to Charles Booth's around 30%. And Seebohm said the wages paid for unskilled labour in York are insufficient to provide food, shelter and clothing adequate to maintain a family of moderate size in a state of physical efficiency. So when the book was published, it had a significant impact. It showed that London was not unique. There was similar poverty across the country. And it influenced politicians such as David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill, and it became a major influence on the 1906 to 11 liberal welfare reforms, which basically laid the foundation for the welfare state. Before Seebohm, his poverty book was just the start. He revisited it with a second and third study of poverty, and we have copies of those on the table as well. And he also did work on other areas such as land reform, unemployment, and for him there wasn't really a separation between what he was doing at Rowntree's cocoa works at the factory and his sociological work, so both would inform each other. And this enabled him to develop and advocate for an approach to wealth, which most succinctly summed up in a chapter he wrote in Rufus Jones' books, Religious Foundations, published in 1923. And in this, he stated that we are forced to recognize that the housing problem is primarily a poverty problem and to consider our economic system and the distribution of wealth. He suggested radical changes that were needed in industry. And when he says industry, he kind of means society as well. And so the first was that it needed to create goods and provide services beneficial to the community, and then to pay the greatest possible regard to the general welfare of the community, and finally to distribute wealth in such a manner as will be best serve the highest ends of the community. And also that the minimum wage should enable a family not just to have decent housing and essentials covered, but also a reasonable margin for contingencies and recreation. And elsewhere, Seebohm wrote about the minimum wage being a living wage and one that would allow people to take a full part in society, not just survive. So that leads us on to what did the Rowntrees do with their wealth themselves? So first of all, we can think about the company and the environment and the assets they created there, some of which I've already mentioned. But it was a factory that was situated within gardens. They had sports fields. They also had facilities for employees to develop hobbies and interest groups. I often think of them as like university societies that they had going on at the factory. But also, where can we find Rowntree wealth in York today? And the more I look at this, the more there is a kind of invisible spider's web of Rowntree wealth and assets across the whole city. And in fact, at least two of us, if not all of us, sat on this panel, our jobs are, if not fully funded or partly funded at different times by Rowntree wealth. I did a little bit of mapping myself, just off the top of my head, about assets that we still have in York that either partly or originally started with Rowntree wealth. But I keep finding more. And the list, again, there's less on the list than on the map, and it was just off the top of my head. But even yesterday, doing some research, I discovered a park that used to be near a house I lived in was given to the city by the Rowntrees. It's back park in the Lehman Road area. And that's without the kind of headline ones that we might think of, such as Rowntree Park, Homestead Park, and the properties owned by the trusts, which used to be Seebohm's estate. But it also got me thinking about changes and about who owns some of these today and what's happened with that wealth, because it is now fragmented. It is not owned by this kind of triangle of the Rowntree family, the company and the trusts, and it's all kind of been split off. and how that wealth gets used and moved around, or how some of these organisations, the one that comes to mind is the Cocoa Works Brass Band, which still exists, except now it's known as the Shepherd Group Brass Band, because the Shepherd Group now fund it. So how some of these that might have been started with Rowntree wealth have had to then go looking elsewhere to continue. There is also another side of Rowntree wealth that needs considering, and that's Rowntree inequality. And despite the criticisms and concerns of the family, which were deeply held, and I don't want to undermine that, the family's wealth did come primarily from the company, and therefore they were very active participants in a capitalist system that unfairly distributed wealth. And Seebohm really focused on, places and knocking on doors and going to houses. So I thought that we could use houses as a way of illustrating this. So let's see if I can work this. Up here, this is the homestead, Seebohm's house. And it's worth knowing that he didn't just have that large house, he also had the garden house, what's now Homestead Park, and also what's now the youth hostel, which was part of his estate as well. So quite a lot of property. And the 1911 census records Seebohm living with his wife Lydia, their 4 children, and a governess and 5 servants. The next house is this one, number 17 Hawthorne Street in the Hewerthorpe-Layerthorpe area. We know about this house in the 1920s to 1940s because this is where the chief shop steward, the main trade unionist at the Rowntree's factory, lived. And at one point he lived there with his wife, her sister, and their friend, and 3 of the 4 of them worked at Rowntree's. And I've got a quote up there from Seebohm about his criticism of this kind of terrace housing, where he calls it rows of cages for factory hands and a dreary waste of featureless, unlovely dwellings. And he's writing that at the same time that his chief shop steward, who becomes good friends with him, is living in that house. And then we have, over here, Dorothy Wilson's hospital, or at the time, Almshouse. And this is where Irene Pickup, another worker and important trade unionist at the factory, lived for most of her life, probably in a dormitory. And this brings up another idea about wealth, in that she may have been able to afford possibly a terrace house or a small house, but because she was a single woman, that would have basically been, she wouldn't have been able to rent those places. She does move out of that house in the 1930s, where she goes to live with her retired father. And you wonder at the point that she's able to get a house because she's moving in with her father. And then finally, at the bottom there, we have the housing that people lived in who worked on Rowntree's plantation estate in Dominica, where they were processing the raw materials such as cocoa that the company relied upon. So the wealth that Seebohm and the Rowntree's family has is being generated by the people who are living in these much smaller and more impoverished dwellings. So that's kind of the end of my bit, and this slide is just to prompt you to kind of, if you want to know more about Rowntree history, this is where you can find everything about the Rowntree Society. We've got a table over there with display on and handouts, including our 5 Rowntree walks, where you can see in York things that are associated with the Rowntree Company.
Thank you so much, Nick. Amazing. Thank you. So as I said earlier, we'll have a Q&A later, so I've got lots of questions from what Nick said, so I'll try not to ask too many questions. We're going to hand over now to Professor Karen Rowlingson, who's going to talk to us about wealth, and I think you're also going to talk a little bit about the collaboration on the mapping.
Yeah. Is it okay if I stand up? Because I don't have any slides to click, and I know there's a lot of people at the back, so I thought I'd say hello. So that was fascinating, Nick, absolutely fascinating. And I'm going to sort of really follow on from what Nick said and perhaps just reinforce a lot of the points he's made. But As Nick said, Rowntree's groundbreaking poverty report was published in 1901, just at what was the tail end of what was known at that point as the Gilded Age, when extreme wealth existed alongside extreme poverty. And you can see from the maps and photos the slum areas of part of York, in fact, Walmgate, Hungate, which is just over the road from here, and streets near Micklegate were sort of the slum areas particularly. And they were alongside areas of, as Rowntree and as Nick said, districts inhabited by the servant-keeping class, places around Bootham, the Mount, Holgate Hill. I don't know where you live, whether you live in York and you recognise some of those places, but in those days, those were the different areas, and there were the others that Nick spoke about. Rowntree's report, again, as Nick said, and that of other pioneers in social policy, led to the welfare reforms of Lloyd George, but also, crucially, to Lloyd George's People's Budget, which introduced far higher levels of taxation of wealth to help pay for some of those reforms, the old age pension in particular. So that taxation included inheritance tax, or death duties, estate duties, and land value tax. So quite, well, very radical. And because they were so radical, also incredibly opposed at the time. There was heavy resistance by the wealthy and the powerful to those reforms, and it caused a constitutional crisis. But Lloyd George had, I think, the courage and the conviction to really keep going, and democracy prevailed, and those reforms were introduced. Later on, if we go a bit further forward, during and after the Second World War, we had further reforms in social security. We had further nationalisation of wealth. We had a new National Health Service, continued higher levels of taxation, a growth in council and social housing, which all helped to reduce inequality further by tackling both poverty and high levels of wealth. Go for a little bit of history over the 20th century here, but if we go then fast forward to the late 1970s, it's quite a key turning point at that period, where the argument was made that to boost economic growth, which was faltering at the time, we needed to cut taxes, we needed to cut public spending on the welfare state. And as a result of those changes, inequality increased quite dramatically in the 1980s. It's fluctuated since and gone up and down, but it's still remaining at an incredibly high level at the moment. And we've seen in the last, say, 30 years, not just a growth in wealth, but a growth in extreme levels of wealth. And perhaps we could say we're living in a new Gilded Age as a result. Just to give a very few sort of figures here in terms of wealth levels, the Sunday Times started producing a rich list in 1989, and at that point they identified 15 billionaires in Britain owning a total of £27 billion. Today, we have over 150 billionaires in Britain, that's 10 times as many, holding around 700 billion, that's 25 times as much. Another statistic here is that the richest 50 families, that's 50, the richest 50 families in Britain now hold more wealth than the halfest poorest of the population. So 34 million people combined have as much wealth as the top 50 families. Just a few figures on poverty, because we don't want to forget poverty in all of this. They both matter very much. More than 13 million people in the UK live in poverty, including 4 million children. That headline figure's remained relatively stable over the last 20 years, but we've seen a deepening of poverty. Much of this is research carried out by Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So a deepening of poverty among that number. And indeed today we have 4 million people who are living in destitution, unable to afford the basics to feed themselves and their families, to stay warm, to keep dry and keep clean. And while York is a very wealthy city on average, there are deep pockets of poverty in York too, and around 1 in 5 children in York living in poverty. Poverty really matters. I think most people here and most people generally agree that. We might disagree a little bit on the definitions, the causes, what we do about it, we might, but most people agree poverty matters. But as Victoria asked at the beginning, does wealth matter? Is this just about the politics of envy, which is often a criticism that is played when you talk about levels of wealth? Well, I think research by people like Kate Pickett, who at the University of York, a colleague of mine, great friend, really demonstrate very clearly that it's inequality that matters. It's inequality, the gap between the rich and the poor, which is responsible for a range of problems, for social and political polarisation that we see around us increasingly, for environmental degradation, for low levels of physical and mental health, and as well as poor economic performance too. So there's no evidence that inequality helps growth, for example. It's actually a drain on economic performance and growth. You might have seen, perhaps in the news recently, that healthy life expectancy in Britain has actually fallen by 2 years, and is now averaging at 61, just under 61, with huge inequalities by class and other groups. And I looked up some figures in York. So in York, if we look at total, not just healthy, but total life expectancy, between the most economically deprived wards and the most affluent, the gap is 11 years. So a young boy born in Westfield would have a life expectancy of 76, a young boy born in Copmanthorpe, 87, a young girl born in Westfield, a life expectancy of 81, born in Copmanthorpe, 92. I think there's only 3 miles difference between those areas, but the life expectancy is 11 years. So inequality, I would argue, causes a range of social, political and economic problems. But as I think Natasha is going to say a bit more about later, and very convincingly, I think, in my view, poverty and wealth are directly linked and caused by the economic system, and this is going back to Rowntree and things Nick has said too, directly caused by an economic system which extracts, which takes wealth, in a sense, from one group and then gives that to another, to the benefit of another. So we seem to be stuck in a vicious cycle, really, where the wealthy, particularly the super wealthy, I'm not talking about ordinary wealth here, we're talking about super wealth, ultra wealth, those groups have a range of powerful mechanisms to resist change, which might benefit the population more generally, just as Lloyd George faced that massive resistance to his reforms in the early 1900s. So what should we do about this? Well, there's actually quite a lot of public support, and you can see this in public attitude surveys, for raising wealth taxes on the wealthy, the super wealthy, and particularly the ultra wealthy, and to use that to strengthen public services and the social security system further. But again, there's a lot of resistance to that. But perhaps alongside the redistribution of wealth and income, we also do need to look at those underlying causes, the underlying nature of the system that is causing the inequality. So perhaps we need to ask ourselves the question, again, echoing back to Victoria, as to why is it that some people have so much and many have so little? Is it because of meritocracy? Is it because some groups work much harder than others? Or is it because that some people are very fortunate to be born better off and then benefit further from advantages in the system that enable them to preserve and then perhaps expand their wealth? Of course, it's some combination. There is hard-working people who do well and so on. There's no doubt about that. But there's clear evidence that the greater degree of economic inequality, the more entrenched both poverty and wealth become, and so the less meritocratic we are. Again, I think Natasha might say a little bit more about this in a minute, but before she does, I'll sort of try to wrap up a little bit by telling you about this new project that we'll be working on together with good organisation, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, hopefully a range of partners across the city. Because what we want to do is map wealth in York, again, kind of following on from Rowntree's tradition and his pioneering study. The project is going to be led by Kit Colliver at the University of York. I don't think Kit can be here today. Unfortunately, if they are, then please do wave, but I don't think Kit is, so apologies for that. But Kit will be leading the project. And the idea is we'll be working with local people in York and in particular parts of York to look through the archives, to draw on administrative data, to trace changes in land and property ownership and value over time. We'll also draw on oral histories from people living in York, carry out walking interviews with people across down the streets where people have lived, some for many, many years, and produce visual and narrative accounts, also compiling street biographies to chronicle who owns York, how this has changed over time. Now, I've focused in my talk a lot about personal ownership of wealth, but as others have said, it's not just wealth, land, property is not just owned by individuals, it's owned by companies, owned by universities, owned by charities, organisations, the government, the local government, the church, a range of organisations. So we'll be mapping this in all those different dimensions and asking the question who benefits from different forms of ownership. As well as working very closely with local people to do the mapping and the work, at a later stage in the project, we definitely want to have much wider dissemination and discussion with a much larger group of the population in York to reflect on what we find and to think through what that means and how we take that forward and what we can do about it. So hopefully just quick summary. I would argue that economic inequality really matters, both in terms of poverty and wealth. In the last few decades, we've seen a growth in extreme poverty and extreme wealth. These are linked to each other and cause major social, political, and economic problems. We can change this through both economic and social reform, but also by tackling the underlying nature of the system. We'll be doing new research with people in York to explore this further through and following on from that pioneering work of Rowntree. And in the autumn, we're planning to have an event and launch a report on some of the research that we've already been doing in York on poverty and wealth. But it will take a little bit longer before we complete the project, but we'll still be very much engaging with people while we do that. Okay, I think I'll need to hand over to Tash at this point. Thank you.
Hello, so my name's Natasha, or Tash Almond, and I'm from the Good organisation, which is very much concerned with how money that comes in through tourism can be redistributed to the people that live in those communities. And so we're very, very excited to get together with Joseph Rowntree and the university to look much deeper into this work. I'm going to have to put my glasses on, I'm getting old. So, Good organisation's work is very much rooted in the practical question, how do we make local economies with a focus on the visitor economy work better for the people and places they're supposed to serve? So when we often talk about poverty and disadvantage and inequality, as if they were simply problems of low income, individual hardship, or poor life chances, as such as Nick sort of like described earlier. But if we only look at poverty, we miss the other side of the picture. Where does wealth sit? Who owns the assets? Who receives the financial flows? And how decisions are shaped by ownership and power? This is why the idea of wealth mapping seems so important at this time. Our role as Good organisation is going to help to sort of ground this work in the sort of lived experience, local knowledge, and community-facing practice. So we're really interested in how mapping of ownership and assets and the local economic benefit can be more visible, not as an abstract academic exercise, but as something that helps communities really understand what is happening around them and what the practical choices that might be possible to them. So this feels significantly important in York because of the historical connections that we've got with Seebohm Rowntree's poverty of mapping. And as Victoria says, this work has been hugely influential, but very much of its time. It looked at poverty from the outside, and in ways that could feel judgmental or done to communities. A contemporary wealth mapping has to take a different approach. It should not simply examine people or places from above. It should help to be shaped by communities using community-led research, lived experience, and local participation. As we've discussed earlier, the question is not just where is poverty, it's also where is wealth? Who owns York? Where does that money flow? Who benefits from the local economy? And where are the people, communities, and public institutions losing power over their assets that shape their lives? For me, one of the key starting points is that wealth is very, very different from income, and I think everyone's mentioned that here. Income is what you earn, but when you're at school, you're very much told, you know, social mobility, everyone can be something, you just need to work really hard. But we know that's not really the case. Wealth is what people own, and modern economies are structured around ownership. I'm hoping that this slide, people who own assets often receive continuous cash flow. Rent flows from the landlords, interest flows to lenders, dividends flows to shareholders, profits flow to business owners and investors. Commercial property, housing, land, finance, and infrastructure all generate returns to those who own them. So when we talk about the flow of wealth, we are really asking who owns all the things that other people need to live and work and participate in society. This matters in very, very practical ways. When we see that more and more homes are being used for Airbnbs, at the same time that homelessness rises, we need to understand ownership and the incentive structures behind that. If communities want to talk about bringing back buildings into public use, we need to know who owns them, what they cost, and whether local people or community organisations could ever realistically access them. If we talk about community land ownership, we need to understand what actually means for a city where land and property values are way beyond what ordinary residents can access. So in 2023, we did some initial mapping around who owns York and discovered that 242 of our central buildings, and this is just a snapshot, were owned by offshore foreign investors. And we started to dig behind all of those companies. It would have taken us years to find out who actually owned those buildings. So it was really important for us because there's a lot of conversation about how we're going to take back ownership of our buildings, but it's really hard when you can't talk to the landlords that own them. And so I looked at, there was a property going that was going to be a Roman museum on Rougier Street. My maths has gone a bit wrong. It was about 3 years ago, but I thought that if everybody in York, including all the babies, put in £200, we could just about afford to buy that tiny, or 2 or 3 buildings on Rougier Street. We wouldn't have any money to retrofit it or anything, but you know. So this is why evidence is so very important, because solutions, they can sound good, but unless they are, you know, based in reality, a lot of it sounds very disconnected. So we need to understand and be asking the questions. Wealth mapping can help us do that. Who owns residential and commercial property? How much ownership is local, national, or international? How much money leads through rent, debt, profit, and external ownership? And where are empty and underused assets that communities could use or need? And where are the private, public, and institutional decisions being reinforcing inequality? This is also about understanding how wealth concentrates over time. And I think you touched on some of that earlier, but those that already own assets can use that income from those assets to buy more assets. So wealth generates cash flow generates more assets generates more cash flow. Meanwhile, ordinary households often spend their time on the income on housing, bills, debt, basic costs of living, leaving very little money themselves to build wealth. And I was just watching a program on data centers going up in parts of South America. And, you know, that's where communities spending 60% of their income on just rent alone. So that's why poverty should not be treated as an individual failure. It is often the outcome of wider systems of ownership, extraction, and unequal access to assets. Debt is a big part of that picture too. Debt for one person is an asset for another. A mortgage, a loan, government bonds create an income stream for whoever owns that debt. The financial systems allow wealth holders to earn more money by owning claims on people's future income. So if we're going to talk about mapping wealth, we also need to think about debt, finance, and benefits and from interest payments. Also, economic shocks can make this worse. During recessions and times of crisis, ordinary families may be forced to sell off their assets and take on more debt, while those wealthier individuals and institutions can buy all of that property at discounted prices. So often in a time of crisis, we see that money, again, is redistributed upwards. At the moment, there's all sorts of different legislations going around on housing, but and landlords are selling it off, property developers are struggling sometimes with funding, and we've got investment companies coming in, and they have been buying up lots and lots of assets too. So it's such a complex picture. The same is across wealth across generations. So families with assets can help the next generation to invest earlier, take opportunities, avoid debt, and inherit wealth. Families without assets often have to start again from scratch. It's very difficult to build wealth through wages alone when others inherit capital. And this directly links to what's happening to middle-income earners, where households are feeling, the rising in house costs, higher debts and wages that are not keeping up pace with asset prices. And the cost of living means that more and more income flows upwards and outwards towards lenders, utility companies, and shareholders. So this wealth mapping is not just about collecting data, it's about making visible the systems that shape our everyday life. And I first got really interested in it as a culmination of going to the Tate Modern, where an artist back in the 60s had tried to map out ownership in New York. And he created these wonderful sort of images, visual images, to help get that message across. However, the powers that be kept that very much blocked for a long period of time, and that his art wasn't shown because they didn't want people having those sort of conversations. So what we're doing could be very risky. But the last couple of points is that also, I think I flipped too soon there. There's also about democracy. So concentrated wealth can also become concentrated power. Wealthy interests and wealthy interests, as we know, can influence policy, shape public opinion, and fund lobbying and protect economic systems that continue to benefit asset owners. So if we care about democracy, we need to understand not only who has the income, but who has the ownership, the influence, and the decision-making power. Good organisation would want to approach this both through looking at the research, but also a democratic process, alongside analysing the ownership of housing and land and commercial property, business ownership and investment flows and debts and so forth. We want to involve residents and community organisations, local governments, universities, housing associations, social enterprises and so forth, and people with lived experience of poverty. The work should not be just done with should be done with communities and not to them. So we want to unpick some of that historical injustice to try again. That would mean maybe paying community researchers, looking at participatory mapping, neighbourhood conversations, and trusted local partnerships. Residents, and this is the most exciting bit, should help define the questions. Where do they see their money leaving communities, their communities? Who owns the assets that shape their life, the swimming pools, their dance clubs, the infrastructure, the social infrastructure that helps build those communities? Where does the power sit in York? What forms of local wealth are currently overlooked? And what practical challenges could keep more wealth ownership rooted and decision-making rooted in the local economy? This is also where we can connect wealth mapping to alternative models. I'm very much interested in stewardship and reciprocity, which I always struggle to say, and shared ownership. So years ago, I founded York Time Bank, which ran for about 7 years. And it was based on mutual exchange, valuing people's time and skills and contributing beyond money. The gift economy is something that is really important because it reminds us that exchange of money does not just have to end at the point of purchase. It can build relationships and trust and mutual obligations. And I call it the reciprocity blockchain, which obviously, I can't say. But recently I just read a book on indigenous economics called The Serviceberry, and it's a very short book, so I do look out for it. It's brilliant. And it talks about how neighbours, exchange squashes and vegetables and things. And I've started growing a lot of lettuces, and with the idea that I really want to exchange lettuces with my neighbours and my friends. That isn't working very well because no one seems to want my lettuces. But I am getting back squashes, chili plants and stuff. So at the moment, it's a one-way. It's not quite how I imagined. But the conversations that we have down the allotment are building those relationships that that you can fall back on. And that's very, very different to purchasing something in Morrison's. So this really matters because in this current economy, often reduces value to price. But communities know that value also lies in care and relationships and local knowledge and culture and shared spaces and ecological stewardship. So the question becomes, how do we build an economy that recognises and protects those forms of wealth too? We started to touch on some solutions that were involved in national policy, taxing the wealth more fairly, closing the loopholes, taxing excessive gaps between the chief execs and the workers. Oh, I need to turn the page, sorry. I thought it was a bit confusing. And bringing back utilities into public ownership and making sure that the workers keep more of the wealth that they help create. However, for me, I think we need to be really honest about those challenges. Wealthy interests can resist change through lobbying and political influence. And public relations. Governments face financial barriers when they're trying to buy back assets into public ownership. Bond markets and borrowing costs can make public ownership very, very difficult. So we need to think very creatively about how we might make change happen. One possibility is that, we can mirror the financial systems for good. We've heard of the Bank of Dave. Investment for community benefit, public wealth funds, community ownership funds, etc. But probably what we mainly need to do is to keep growing our power of convening conversations and keeping those local community power in the grassroots thing, something that they can't touch. In that sense, wealth mapping is not just about showing what is wrong, it is showing about where intervention is possible. It can help us move from vague statements like, we need more community ownership, to practical questions. What can be owned and who actually owns it? How much is that actually going to cost? And how are we going to finance that? And what governance model would we need to put in place to protect it? And how would that wealth go back into the communities that we're supporting? So ultimately, I think the purpose of wealth mapping is to change the conversation, and Victoria alluded to this earlier. Instead of asking, how do we reduce poverty? We also have to ask, how is wealth created, extracted, concentrated, and shared? Instead of only measuring deprivation, we measure ownership and power. And instead of treating communities as places of need, we recognize them as places of knowledge and assets and relationships and possibility. And instead of accepting that the economy where wealth continually flows upwards and outwards, we ask, what would it take to keep more wealth circulating locally, democratically and fairly? And those that stay for the second session might find out a bit more about what York's doing to keep that here. So that, for me, is the real potential of this work, to make the invisible visible, to give communities better evidence, to open up a serious conversation about how we build a more equal local economy. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all three of you. I am going to ask a couple of questions and give a reflection from some of the stuff I've heard. Then I'm going to open up to the floor for you guys to ask any questions. So it was funny earlier, Nick, when you said there's so many times you hear about Joseph would be spinning in his grave about this. And like, I hear that a lot as well. What would Joseph think? And it's funny, in our CEO's office, whenever I lurk in there when he's not around, there's a picture of Joseph on the wall that sort of like looks down on us. We feel it's like moral judgment on what we're doing. Like, what would Joseph think? And I just wonder what you think Joseph and Seebohm would think about some of the things you guys have talked about in terms of wealth, inequality. Like, what would their sense be, do you think? And welcome views from anyone. Do you want to maybe start, Nick?
I always find this kind of question difficult as a historian because you're effectively taking people out of their historical context. What I do find both interesting, remarkable, and sometimes depressing is how relevant a lot of the quotes from Joseph, Seebohm, but also Arnold and other members of the Rowntree family, can be applied today. And I do think that they would be disappointed because they were, at a time of kind of particularly Seebohm and Arnold and that generation of like modernism. Things are, things are getting better, things are improving, and they saw their work as part of that. And to think 125 years later, we're having these same kind of discussions. I do think they would find disappointing.
Thank you. Anyone else want to?
I was reading some of Lloyd George's speeches in preparation for this, and in the 1900 speech he made about the People's Budget, he said, we want to do this so that future generations won't have to suffer in poverty, and of course we still have it. So it is, I agree. I think it's just we have to constantly fight for social justice and to reduce inequality, and it's a battle we just have to keep working on. I hope we can achieve it one day to eradicate it, but we've just got to keep fighting.
Thank you.
What I think is, I think he'll feel a bit sick, actually. I think, because he knows that they were holding some of that wealth as a family, but also hopefully pleased that the system is so complex. It's not easy to unpick, and they've started some of that thinking, but reality is, you hope things are going to pan out certain ways, and you just don't know what impacts are going to be. So I hope that they would be pleased that we're forwarding, that work.
I think Seebohm would be very pleased about the idea of some of this being redone 125 years. Like, there's something about that methodology being repeated, which I think is, I think they'd like that being marked. The other thing I was reflecting on as you were all talking was, the original Rowntree mapping, it was very much people going into people's houses, making very clear judgments on like the way they were living their lives, etc. But the accessibility of them to be able to knock on doors and sort of just welcome themselves in, and the power probably that was held in that role, is something that really stands out to me. And then, Tash, when you were talking about trying to figure out who owns these places, it's almost impossible. You've got to be a forensic financial specialist. And I just wondered, it was a reflection really around actually how different that is and the power that comes with concealing some of this information, which, as you say, we're uncovering something in this wealth mapping that might not be that popular to some people. But I just wonder what you think the power of unlocking that could be, and maybe any reflections you have on that different sort of accessibility of information.
For me, I was always interested in pension flows because, I think only 2% of our pensions are actually invested in sort of the UK. And if we had 20%, if that could increase, then that could support sort of more of our sort of local and regional economies. So it is scary, but I think it will start to enlid that people wouldn't be so much more educated, where they're going to invest. So they don't understand shares and how that works, and understand debt, and understand some of these things and who actually holds the money. And actually, debt is necessary, you know, because that creates money. Until we get some of this information out there in ways that people can understand, they can't make informed decisions about how they invest, you know, what they spend their money on, and what choices they make. So, you know, that's very much for me why we're excited about this project.
It's an economic justice,
Yeah.
you know, angle, definitely. Anyone else want to add?
Yeah, so the way we research poverty has changed radically in my lifetime. So when I started doing research, it was, I wouldn't say quite the same as the way that Rowntree did, but, you know, it was very much researchers as experts going in and asking questions and deciding what the questions were and how to, you know, then analyse that data. And I think that's changed very radically and quite rightly to be much more co-produced research involving people with experience and expertise around these subjects that you're talking about, asking them to help design the questions, do the research, and then analyse it all. So I think that's really, really good. I think that's in relation to poverty. In relation to research on wealth, there just hasn't been that much because it's, first of all, not necessarily seen as a problem, at least hasn't been the last 50 years or so. Even if it's then seen as a problem, how do you get the data on this? People don't want to tell you about their wealth. In fact, the very wealthy don't even know how much wealth they have, so there's no point even asking them. You need to get their wealth advisors and their fund, and it's all hidden, and so it's really difficult. There's more research in the last 10 years on wealth, obviously Thomas Piketty, a lot of research in the UK, but it's really difficult. So I don't underestimate, but we've got to start the journey and work with people on doing it.
I remember there was a little piece in the BBC not long ago about a town in County Durham that is owned by billionaires. And the people in that town are saying, we need these things to change, like all these shops are empty, we need these houses to be repaired, etc. But these billionaires bought the whole village, the swimming pool, the town hall, you know, just on a lot, they just bought it. But they don't think the billionaires know they own it, because it will just be a tiny line on a spreadsheet of investments.
Yes, yeah.
And these are people's lives, you know? So there's some incredible stories of the sort of personal elements of this and the hidden nature of, you know, the fact that people don't even know they own a town is just absolutely remarkable.
And the opposite in, I think, Selby and Tadcaster, owned by, is it Samuel Smith? Get a bit wrong with the Smiths. He does know he owns those buildings, but he's letting many of them go into rack and ruin, you know, so that's a shame.
I had one more question and then I'm going to open up to the floor. So, you know, with the original mapping, we heard about some of the things that changed because of it. So it led to the Lloyd George announcements, the sort of welfare, pre-welfare state, and etc. And the idea of a poverty line. I just wonder what you think could come from this. So if we were to have the same influence, which I'm sure, of course we will, that Seebohm have, like, what are your hopes about what could change in terms of policy or perception? Karen, I don't know if you want that.
Gosh, yeah, I'm keeping a really open mind, because I think the real advantage of this is doing this work collectively and collaboratively. I mean, we have, as you know, Victoria, I've talked before about the idea of a wealth line. Should we consider that? We've had a lot of research, a lot of thinking about a poverty line, and there's, again, disagreements about that and different ways of looking at it, but we do have a body of thinking about it. We've had very little conversation about a wealth line. So Victoria talked about ordinary wealth. What do we mean by ordinary wealth? What do we mean about wealthy, super wealth, ultra wealth, and does it matter, you know, where you draw these lines? And there's some great work going on, a Dutch philosopher, Ingrid Robbins, who writes about, it's called limitarianism. Is there a limit to which people should have money above which? Because it's dangerous. It's maybe dangerous in terms of democracy, maybe dangerous in terms of polarisation, other kind of reasons why there should be a limit. And then how you police the limit is another question. But I think there is something about, you know, the different levels of wealth inequality. We've looked at a lot at poverty, which is still really important, but we haven't looked so much at the top and where we might draw lines. So I think it'd be an interesting question to explore.
And I think linked to that is the sense that it's very hard to comprehend the level of wealth that we're talking about. So there's a brilliant video, Patriotic Millionaires have done, I think it's like a 3-minute video if you want to Google it, and it's on a high street, and there's briefcases full of these little tokens. And people are saying, right, okay, how much do you think is okay for people to own in terms of wealth, in terms of tokens? Look at this. So this is how much an ordinary person earns. in comparison, what do you think is okay? And people will sort of triple it and say, well, if you work really hard, maybe this is okay. And then they show the equivalent of the tokens that we're talking about with extreme wealth. And it's literally, briefcase after briefcase full of these tokens. And people say, oh, that's just not right. But because these figures are so mind-boggling, it's really hard to actually think what this wealth looks like in practice. So I think the idea of a wealth line is really interesting to me, because you have to sort of comprehend the levels that we're talking about as well. And I think this research that we're talking about can help unveil some of the mysteries of this wealth to, ordinary folk in York. So yes, very excited about it. I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to open the floor for anyone who has questions. There's a hand shot up over there. I don't know if anyone's got a roving mic, I hope.
Hello, and thank you very much for this morning. My name's Ruth Dunlop, and I'm the fundraising manager with Restore York. We're preventing homelessness in York. And that's so, trying to actually change something and take people out of the cycle. And so I suppose there's two parts to this. I'm particularly concerned about what I see amongst 18 to 25-year-olds in some of those poorer areas of York that you've identified. And I see what Rowntree said, still happening. People go in and out of poverty throughout their lives. And then when their 18-year-olds reach that point in life, they say, right, it's time to go. Leave. And those people become invisible homeless in York. And we eventually find some of them come to us, and we provide a home and some hope and some community, because they become really lonely and they just lose hope. And it's really important for me that we actually ask those people who are a bit hidden in this work that you're doing, what can we do about it? What is it like for them? And also, just for information, there is a Christian church project going on in York at the moment called No One Left Behind, which is already mapping some poverty, including loneliness and other kinds of poverty. And I just want to hope that there's a link with you, and if there isn't, let's make a link. Thank you.
Fab, thank you so much. And I think it's such an important point about the hidden, because as we're talking about like hidden data, hidden information, actually making sure that we're finding, a cross-section of people to ask, and that no one is left behind in the research feels really important. I don't know whether anyone wants to respond to that point further.
I was going to talk around sort of some of the stuff we're doing around sort of community-led tourism, I suppose, with the hospitality sector, who that do create jobs for younger people, but obviously some of those tensions between policy that we have at the moment, that means that that younger people are struggling to get into the they were trying to lower increase the wages, which means there's less jobs, and so it's really complex about how we sort of create those opportunities for young people. But so one of my biggest concerns is seeing the ballet schools and the sort of sports pavilions and those sorts of things that our social infrastructure shut down as they're bought and changed into assets and Airbnbs. And I think that needs to be mapped, because those swimming pools, those leisure centres are so much part of what we need to develop wealth beyond, financial wealth in people, and create a sound and good society that, this is why some of this is so important to bring it to the surface.
Just say we are really keen to work with a whole range of different organisations, so it may be that Kit is already aware of these different ones, but please do email me if you think that Kit might not be, and we're trying to reach out to different places. And absolutely, we do want to cover all age groups and different kinds of groups within this, and be very inclusive in the way we approach it. And we can see from the statistics that came out recently around the so-called NEETs, and not in employment, education or training, it's an incredibly high level in Britain today, one of the highest probably in Europe, and very high historically. So there's a real issue with the labour market, with education system and so on. I mean, these are complex problems, but yeah, this one project probably can't touch on everything, but it's a really important point, and good luck with the work, really.
Thanks, Karen. Anyone, lady in the front?
Again, thank you very much. As somebody who used to vote Labour, and for people who would like to vote Labour, we're sympathetic to the idea of reducing inequality, but I'd like to ask the panel, why do they think the Labour government seems so reluctant to tax wealth?
Great question. We now have to embody Labour politicians, so yeah, let's all hang on there.
I've spent quite a long time puzzling over this and being frustrated by it. So yeah, I don't know where to start really. There is obviously within the Labour Party and Labour government the different views on this, and there are some members who are very much advocating for, and there have been some, and I'm not apologising, I'm not a member of the party myself, but yeah, so there have been some changes. There have been some introduction of inheritance tax. They brought in a tax on farms, in it, and that you see the resistance that comes up, and I think they might have backtracked on that even. But there's an increasing amount of evidence that again, wealth taxes are popular, that they can make a really important difference. The logic behind it, so things that seem to me quite simple and obvious, like aligning capital gains tax rates with income tax rates. Why should you sit on an asset, and that accumulates income, and it's not taxed as high as your hard-earned labour. I don't really get the defence of that really. So it is a puzzle. I think the Labour Party's in a particular place at the moment. Who knows where it's going? I think it's not in a popular place. So I think it will change, and I think this has to be part of the conversation personally, but that's a personal view.
I do worry that, stuff I've read around the anti-democratic movement, so actually so much money is piled into ensuring that these policies don't work, and we're never going to see a Green person come, and we're never going to see Jeremy Corbyn, reach those heady heights. So I think the reality is we've got other powers playing here. And so we could come up with some fantastic solutions, but carrying them out may not be in our control.
And to jump in to try and be a little bit more positive, the Rowntree history sets, I guess, examples, because the Rowntree family, a lot of the things they did, they wanted to do not just to do them, but also as examples. So, when they set up New Earswick and they built it there, it wasn't just to provide better housing, but it was to demonstrate to local authorities, to, other wealthy people, here's a model that we can get to work. And the same with the factory, and we looked at Joseph's thoughts about wealth. In the 1920s, they implemented a profit sharing scheme. And this had taken about 20 years for them to work out. They'd employed people to help them work it out. And the idea behind it is that at a certain point, the profits the company made would then get paid out to all the workers. And it was all the workers who weren't under a certain amount, because the idea of the ones over it, well, you've already benefited from the profits. And there are these examples where they weren't just, I guess, kind of dreamers who thought we wanted to make things different. They were very much involved in looking at the practical ways that you can change these things.
Yeah, I think I always feel like I've got to say JRF is non-political in terms of parties before I say anything, but maybe I'll speak as Victoria Hughes rather than from JRF. I think it's really interesting. I was involved in some focus groups last year with one of our colleagues, Sarah Kerr, who writes quite a lot about wealth. She's written a really good book called Wealthfity, where she says we need to think about poverty, but we need to think about wealthfity. And she talks about some of the issues that Karen's raised about the problems with wealth. We held some focus groups with people with a range of different voting backgrounds and wealth and etc. I was really fascinated by this idea of what do you think of a wealth tax? And the people I thought might be warm to it weren't. And some of it came back to this idea of meritocracy and this point about what I was saying earlier about people's perception of what wealth is. So there was this sense of people thought it wasn't fair to have a wealth tax because their view of who would be taxed in a wealth tax was people on a much lower income than the reality of a wealth tax would be. So there's something for me about explaining to people, to voters, what a wealth tax means and it's not, if you're on 50 grand, it's not you, you know, it's this other group. So we're developing some research with Faiza Shaheen, who I know isn't in the Labour Party anymore, but was. And we're looking at, in Hartlepool and some other places, working with people in working class communities, doing some community research to figure out what is it that's holding people back from supporting a wealth tax, and how could you build a movement around this, which is almost a sort of skewering of the stop the boats, which is the big, you know, headline. A wealth tax is almost like an antidote to some of that. So we're just beginning to develop that work at the moment. So yeah, it's difficult and it takes time, but you know, there's a lot of interest in this, but I share your frustration. Does anybody, do you want?
That guy at the back with the white t-shirt has had his hand up 3.
So I can kind of add to that, and I've got questions about clarification, but I think one thing that we have to remember about a wealth tax is how easy it is to dodge taxes through offshore bank accounts. Like, I know people personally who've registered their tax residency to Malta to avoid paying, they've paid quarter of the tax that they would have paid in the UK in Malta. Furthermore, I'm just asking about, you talked about asset prices kind of being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Money creates money if you can invest in new stocks and shares. My point is specifically about housing, where we've seen dramatic increases of the price of housing. I was just wondering whether increased profitability of these of real estate is leading to an increase in the house prices due to increased competition between the 1% who can afford these asset prices, and they compete with each other in order to extract and grow wealth from people paying for these assets. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to?
Yeah, so just, you're absolutely right. From doing the research on asking people their views about a wealth tax, this was one of the things they did come up with as a reason why they had concerns about it, and it was that people would avoid it. So you're absolutely right. So what, again, in terms of that policy making, the policymakers have to put more effort into closing loopholes and tackling avoidance and cracking down on it when it happens, because it happens. We spend far more cracking down on benefit fraud, which of course is a problem which needs to be tackled, far more on that than we do on tax fraud. And even though we could recover a lot more through tax fraud work, you know, on a purely kind of efficient model of spending public money, you'd put more money into tackling tax fraud, but we don't. So I think we could do more on that to you know, allay those concerns. On housing, you've touched on, there's a huge kind of question there, isn't it, about the housing market and housing values and prices and so on. But to your point on avoidance, it's much harder to avoid taxes on housing because it's there, and taxes on land because it's there. You can't move it somewhere else, land is there. And going back to Lloyd George on the land value tax, they did introduce it, but in the 1920s they had to row back on it because of the resistance, again, the opposition. And there are challenges to introducing these kinds of taxes, but I think, as Tash said, when the lobby comes out, the powerful lobby come out and always putting more and more objections, well, there are no policy is perfect, but actually, you know, there are really good arguments for these. And the housing market is bonkers. We should have a better council tax, which is more progressive, which is not even really a property tax on, it's a, you know, a tax on for services that paid by tenants, and we could change that tax, but then everybody gets nervous that it's going to affect, you know, you and me, because we pay council tax. Is our bill going to go up? And actually, there are lots of modelling of this that actually most people would pay less with a reformed council tax, and you'd tax more those in the higher valued properties. So I think there's lots we can do to tackle some of the avoidance issue, to think about housing in a way that would also reduce house values at the top. Although, again, there are people, and I live in a house which is worth, you know, more than the average, let's say. But if my price goes down, actually, does it really make that much difference in practice to me? I'm still living in that house, and if I want to move, other houses have come down too. You know? So it's all a bit, I think these are really interesting questions which we should have much more discussion about and understanding, and even for me to improve my understanding of some of these issues. I'm not an economist, so, but some of it I kind of think, I don't quite understand these things. Anyway, Natasha.
You know, there's just another point that I'd heard the other day on Radio 4, which was about, it's a political issue too because of voting. So people who have assets have houses, and if their house price still goes up by that party, we're more likely to vote. So, you know, they quite like housing to keep you know, going as it is. Those considerations too.
Yeah, thank you. We're out of time, sadly. Sorry if I saw another hand whip up there. We'll be around for a little bit, I think. Everyone's going to, if people want to have a chat with us over a cup of tea, you're more than welcome. I'm going to stand up because I felt guilty earlier when you stood up and say thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's been a great session. Thank you so much to Nick, to Karen, to Tash. Just, can we give you a round of applause for... And just on that point about housing, can I make a plug for the second session? Because community wealth building is all about alternative housing models. So stay for a cup of tea. There's some lovely sweet treats. Stay for the community wealth building session. It's going to be great. In terms of the mapping work we've all talked about, keep an eye on the JRF website. We are just beginning to develop the mapping, so it's going to take a while. But we'll be putting updates on the JRF website, so please keep an eye on that. And we'd love this to be a city-wide piece of work, so really interested in involving people across the city, so spread the word. I'm going to finish with a quote from Sarah Kerr. So I mentioned Sarah earlier, and I just love the simplicity of this because I think it wraps up quite a lot of the things we've talked about. So she says, continuing ascent of poverty encourages us to look down. If we want to understand the world we're actually living in, we need to start looking up at wealth and the wealthy. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.